This is a story about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we live out in the world, and the space between those two. It's about how we love, how we lose, and how we recover, or not, through the stories we make up in our heads. I'm Robin Rice, and this is also my story. Chapter 2. Who's to blame? These stories are not only about me. They are also about you. Unless you are here to avoid yourself. But in that case, you would likely have selected something, well, not like this. When we read, we are putting ourselves in the shoes of the story characters, be they real or fictional. If you don't believe me, consider right now that somewhere in your mind you are thinking about whether or not you believe me. You see, you are in this story with me. Your story is unfolding right alongside mine. I and every other storyteller arrive on your nightstand, or in this case your earbuds, to help you reflect on your life, your truth, your sense of meaning, your needs and wants, both hidden and exposed. With or without thinking about it too much, as my story unfolds, in the background you'll consider yours. My life as it compares to your life. My experiences as they compare to the ones you have had. And not only what happened, but why and what was made of it and how. You'll intuitively reflect, assessing how you had some things worse than I did and some things better. You'll take note of the feelings I express, considering when you have felt something similar, or how maybe you have never felt anything like what I am describing. You may inwardly muse about how, in the same situation, you would have done the same as I did, or how you would have opted to take things in a wholly different direction. I am here to narrate and to guide, to provide comparison and contrast, and so hopefully to offer you a fresh way to dive into the stories that are your own. That's the whole story gig. It's why storytelling exists. So while not every 5-year-old has a favorite babysitter die, something precious dies in every childhood. Likewise, something seemingly random will sideswipe each of us, and we will all be left to ask, what the hell was that? Something will occur that makes absolutely no sense, and so, this is key, the lost and bewildered sense maker within us is born. As children, without decent answers or a way to find them, our newly minted inner storyteller is left to silently chew on things, sometimes rehashing the same damn scenario over and over for years, then years upon years. Side note, if you wonder where the noise in your head comes from, a good bit of it originates here. Without realizing it, our inner reality begins to build a life of its own. At the same time, our outer life chugs along like nothing else is going on. Why, nothing else at all. Now we are dual, split, of two minds. Our inner and outer lives appear seamlessly as one, like a projector screen showing two images laid on top of each other. With no one to explain that these two are in fact not one, how are we to know any different? Most often, the inner story never gets sorted. It becomes a concocted, contorted mess because, hey, we're just a kid. What do we know of life at age 5 or 9 or 13? What logic can survive in a child's mind and imagination, both largely unformed? Yet there is something within that will automatically and continuously loop, trying to make some kind of sense until something resolves. Over time, the divide between the inner self and the outer identity becomes vast. And so that bewildered sense maker becomes a committed meaning maker. And from this, every sort of story will be born. This aspect of ourselves builds a bridge between the us inside and the us that shows up in the world out there. Without anyone to point it out, we live like that. Years upon years, just like that. Sometimes until we die. Very often, this is the exact split that makes us feel alone, misunderstood, misaligned, and misfitted to the world and those we are supposed to belong to. And, in the most cruel of tricks, the more aware we are, the more bereft we are likely to feel. I know this part of the story all too well. Enter the labyrinth. Humans have a tendency to idolize those who have died. We forget the bad, the mean, the ugly, and especially the unresolved. We remember the good, often jacking it up in our imaginations to be so much better than it was. It's a psychological thing, I'm told, completely normal. But I idolized Nell Marie Bowders long before she died. Probably from the moment we met, though I cannot remember the day or even the year. Was I 4 years old? 5? Probably 4. I don't have anyone left to ask. One of the most obvious reasons to adore her was that Nell had so many things that I didn't, indicating to me that she was somehow special even from birth. We lived on the same block of the same street in what could have been just about any Midwestern small town. Her house was a rancher to my salt box, though I likely never thought of one as better than the other, except to observe that only 3 people had to share her house as compared to the 5 people in mine. If you looked at it that way, she lived in a mansion, complete with a spare bedroom, a 3-area playroom in the basement, and no brothers to say you can't come in. She was a year older than me, which could easily have set up a kind of adoration in the very early years. When we are young, we are so eager to be seen for the years we have under our belts, we count our ages in halves and even quarters. There were so many things Nell knew that I didn't, and not only because she was both a year and a grade ahead of me. No, the things she knew came from the life she lived, which was crazy full of big and bold experiences. First, she had a boyfriend. Both only 10 years old at the time, they were nonetheless committed to each other. Her parents were not alarmed, as they might have been in the teenage years. I imagine they thought it was cute. Henry. He was a dream. Any girl's dream. Everyone agreed. Looking back, it seems odd that the adults took it so seriously, making a special point to create room for it in their schedules. Through Nell, I got a whiff of romantic love as a gift and a luxury. Something that said you were someone special to someone special. It was the beginning of my yearning for love, my hope and prayer that one day I, too, would have a Henry of my own. Years later, in high school, I would briefly date and fall in love with a guy whose last name happened to be Henry. He was just as handsome and just as wonderful as Nell's Henry. Thinking about the name now, it might have been why I fell so particularly hard for him. Even more impressive, however, were Nell's parents. They were near gods to me, and not only to me. Patricia, the third in our constant little girl trio, understood them to be godlike too. Mr. and Mrs. Bowders were working parents, both educated with advanced degrees in the health field. While both of my parents at that time had undergraduate degrees, the Bowders, we always called them that, the Bowders, as if they had no individual selves and came only as a set. They knew things you were supposed to know. Today I would call them truly educated, which, as we all know, cannot be assumed just because you graduated from college. The Bowders knew, for example, that you could use a brush to clean under your fingernails and that you should. They knew that you needed to eat your vegetables, like lima beans, which my mother never once cooked. They knew cheese shouldn't come in a wrapper, but be bought at a farmer's market, kept fresh under a glass dome, cut and sold to the exact desired size, and finally wrapped in waxed brown paper. They knew how to create a dream play space for 3 little girls and fill 3 separate basement rooms with crafts and toys and countless Barbie dolls. Everything our exuberant imaginations could want. They knew to give their daughter ice skating lessons at the local ice rink to develop grace and poise, which Nell certainly had. They knew how to inspire their child to obey, something truly missing in my house, and how to help her understand that it was her duty to practice piano. After all, they were investing in the lessons. They knew how to build a second house on a small lake in a nearby town over many, many summers, much to the delight of us 3 girls, who got to play as they worked. They knew it was important for Nell to go to Europe so she could learn the kinds of things well-traveled people knew. They somehow knew to have her photographed in a wedding dress, complete with veil, as a portrait at 7 years old. It would be many decades before I realized that this was actually a communion dress. I chalk it up to both the romantic in me and the lack of any cultural education whatsoever in my home. None of the things the Bowders knew were things my parents knew, at least so far as I could tell. While Mrs. Bowders was busy making rhubarb pie, as with lima beans, did my mother even know rhubarb existed? My mother was, well, in those days I could not tell you what she was doing with her college education. Most of all, and this I knew without any evidence required, the Bowders knew how to love. I felt their love for Nell. It was so abundant it spilled out onto me. Amazingly, I never once felt jealous of Nell for having her parents all to herself. She deserved it. I did not, or I would have been given parents like the Bowders too. But boyfriends and attentive parents and ice skating and piano lessons were not all that Nell had going for her. Today, people would call what she had the it factor, or they might describe her as an old soul, or a shining golden child. All I knew, deep in my bones, was that she was special. Just her alone, nothing she had or did. She was alive with something I could feel but had no name for, and far more alive than I was. I could see it, but not be it. And that was okay too. It was enough to be in the aura of her bright light. Even when she was mean to me by siding with Patricia in some argument. Oh God, the setup for triangles began right there, didn't they? I instantly forgave her when her favors turned back toward me. And when we ganged up to be mean to Patricia together, glory, I tell you, full-on glory. I learned to hold a grudge, painfully but with patience, for the jolt of joy that came when Nell and I were once again aligned and acting as one. Nell wasn't perfect, but to me she was. I guess because I loved her. With every bit of me, I loved her. I would later wonder, did God give Nell a Henry early, because she would be gone before most girls were even interested in having one? Did she have a wedding picture because somehow, somewhere, someone knew she would never get married? Did she go to Europe young because she would not have the chance to do so as a foreign exchange student? The Bowders absolutely would have supported that. Let alone on her honeymoon. There was no way to know. But I often asked myself these kinds of things, especially when I was alone at night, wondering about all the things there were to wonder about. Nell was perfectly fine until she wasn't. One day my mother told me she was in the hospital. I assumed she had a broken leg. What else would you go to the hospital for? A week later, they arranged for me to visit. We painted clay parakeets in bright primary colors. Her leg wasn't broken, but she quickly tired and couldn't play for long. No one ever said she could die. That there was, in fact, a very good chance that she would die. That maybe they already knew she was going to die. There was no one to push her out of a car. Whatever was going on, it was going on inside of her. Leukemia, but they only used that word after. I assumed she'd come home soon, but there were less than 21 days between her diagnosis and her death. After the parakeets, I never saw her again. My mother decided I should not go to the funeral, not after how I was at Roxanne's calling. Only when I begged wildly and incessantly was I granted permission to go to the post-service gathering at Nell's house. I had to see the Bowders. Even more, I had to let them see me. I was still alive, and I still loved them. My parents actually let me walk the 5 houses down the street, as I had 1,000 times, alone. It was one of the bravest walks of my life. My legs pulled along like soaked logs. What spirits and daggers would come this time? There were none that I saw, but sadness was its own heavy beast in the rooms of her house, filling all the spaces, making it hard to breathe. Who wanted rhubarb pie now? Not me. I walked around by myself, weaving between the packed rooms, feeling small, feeling things I had no words for. I made a short visit to the basement, still messy with everything everywhere, just as we had left it only a few weeks before. What would they do with her toys? There were so many. I walked into her bedroom and looked in her closet, still full of the prettiest pinks, yellows, and whites. What would they do with all her beautiful clothes? I gathered the courage to touch them and felt the hollowness only death can bring. I went into her parents' room where her wedding picture sat on the dresser. Where would the abundant, even excessive love they had given to her and me go? Would it die too? Had it already? As I walked among the countless strangers, I again wondered, how could something so big and bright, so alive, just end? How could a whole person be here one day and not the next? How could anything as alive as Nell stop existing? Where did the beautiful friend who once laughed and fell down, pet the dogs, and hid out under the weeping willow in the backyard, where did she go? Fortunately, this time an angel appeared to answer my unspoken questions. Not the mystical kind, or maybe she was. This angel appeared in the form of a plump woman with bright white hair who smelled of face powder and old people perfume. A relative of Nell's, though I no longer recall the exact relation. She found me staring at a picture of Nell and sat me down on the Bowders' big bed for an important talk. "Do you know where Nell is now, Robin?" she asked, ever so soft, taking my hands into hers. No, I shook my head, my eyes suddenly full of tears. How did she know my name? And how did she dare speak Nell's? I will tell you. She's in heaven with the angels. She is an angel now, too. God has made a special place for her. A special place that only... I was gone after that. I didn't need to hear anything else. Nell was an angel, of course she was. And God had her. Yes, absolute truth. Just hearing the story was a religious experience. Like the heavenly choirs were right there, pouring light into the old woman in me. A silent waterfall of blessing. Filled with gentle care, this story was given to me like a gift. Tender, fragile, miraculous gift. Instantly death, at least this one, made sense to me. Nell was an angel even before her death. Why wouldn't God want to make her one in heaven? Why would he not have wanted her for himself, just as I had secretly wanted her all to myself? I could see it in my mind's eye and feel it fill up the canyon-wide loss in my heart. I drank this perfect story in and took it as my own. It felt all the more golden because a kind old lady took 5 minutes to give me a hope-affirming story and offer it with conviction. It was more than anyone else had done. That night, alone in my little room, I was not afraid. I knew it was terrible, beyond terrible, that Nell had died. It hurt beyond anything I could have imagined to know that I would never, ever see her again. Not walking down the street. Not at school. Not at her barn house. Not ice skating. Not playing piano. Not with a melting popsicle in the heat of summer. Not anywhere. Even so, I knew I could live with this ending to the story. I could live without Nell, and the Powder's love, and the downstairs playrooms, and the good cheese, and the lima beans, and the rhubarb pie. All of it, if Nell was now an angel with God. I just could not live with what happened next. Parents are funny sometimes. Actually, let's say it straight. Parents are stupid sometimes. To think that because a 9-year-old is listless only a month after the death of her best friend means they ought to arrange for a new best friend is asinine. As if the deep connections of life are plug and play, kid to kid. To arrange for a play date without even asking if I was ready for one. To invite a neighbor girl named Joanne, someone for whom I had absolutely zero soulful affinity, to stay overnight. To pull out the trundle bed and start the bathwater like nothing ever happened to Nell only 5 doors down the street. Joanne and I were in the bathtub together when she complained of not feeling well. My mother checked her over, and it was decided it might be best to carry her home, across the street and 3 doors down in the other direction from Nell's. We would reschedule our overnight for another time. Her parents took her to the doctor, then the hospital, then someone from somewhere took her to the morgue. Allergic to the anesthesia from an emergency appendectomy, she died on the operating table, just like that. Just like that. I have no recollection of being told about Joanne's death. I can imagine my parents must have been at a complete loss as to what to say. A little girl in my bathtub one day and dead the next. Especially after Nell. How could anyone speak to that? And so they didn't, at least as far as I can remember. What I do remember happened several days later. I saw her little sister, only 4 years old, playing by herself on the sidewalk in front of our house. I felt sorry for her, knowing she'd lost a sister, yet she seemed completely unconcerned. I asked her how she was, and she said she was good. She told me that her big sister had gone to live with God in heaven, and that Joanne was an angel now. I felt myself stiffen, then harden, as if permanently stuck in place. No. That story was not right. That story could not be right. That's not how it goes for Joanne. Nell, she was an angel, true and perfect, the real thing. She was goodness and light and beauty and magic and magic and magic. Joanne was just a kid down the street. I didn't even really like her that much. I wanted to feel bad for Joanne and her sister and her mom and her dad. I thought it was only polite to hurt for her the way I hurt for Nell and the Bowders. I really ought to be the kind of person who can care for them all, but I wasn't and I couldn't. I didn't know it then, but I was quickly learning to divide humanity into 2 groups. Humans with light and humans without. Humans with light were hard to come by, and maybe Roxanne and Nell were the only ones. Humans without light were, just as sad and common as I was. Nothing special at all. What deep trouble began brewing in that month of death? I had to figure out why this was happening, to me in particular. I had to make sense of my deaths. Otherwise, if you can bear to think of it straight on, you're stronger than I was. It could happen again. Roxanne, Nell, Joanne. No one, not one other child I had ever met, had this much death in their life. No one went to bed thinking everything was fine, only to wake up to such an overwhelming loss not once but 3 times. You apply the 9-year-old's logic. I was the clear common denominator, so it had to have been my fault. Nothing else made sense. I was some kind of unknowing, unmeaning, silent killer. Worse, much worse, I killed the people I loved and those I didn't, which meant proximity itself was a problem. I didn't have schoolgirl lice or cooties. I had maggots swarming in my guts. What other conclusion could I come to? None. I was dangerous, even if I didn't know how. Which meant that any and every little thing I did could be the thing that could cause it again. I decided the only thing I could decide: to see everything I did as a potentially deadly mistake. They tell me that after Joanne died, I barely spoke for 2 years. I don't remember that, but apparently I carefully and minimally nodded yes or shook my head no, only if I was forced to give an answer to a question. What I do know is that for a long time, my only friend was the voice in my head. Let me tell you, she wasn't very nice. It was as if I dug a hole deep inside my own story, curled in tight like a fetus, cold and wet, and wished the world away. Away, away, for everyone's sake. Enter your labyrinth at BeWhoYouAre.com.